Since Neolithic times, the Acropolis had been the chief stronghold and sanctuary of Athens. But throughout the classical period, most other departments of community life were centered in an open, well-drained area at the northwest foot of the hill. This was the Agora, the gathering place. As one of the most historic sites in Greece, it attracted the attention of archaeologists from early on, and several isolated plots were excavated during the 19th and early 20th centuries. In 1931, the American School of Classical Studies began comprehensive excavation, and although some digging still remains to be done along the north and east sides, the historical development of the site has now become fairly clear. A member of staff from the beginning, from 1947 to 68, Homer Thompson was field director here.
Even before excavation began in 1931, we had known from literally hundreds of references in the ancient authors that this was the spot in Athens in which the life of the city had focused. We knew that this was the center of civic administration, center of banking, commerce. We had known that philosophers taught here. This was the place, surely, where all the great figures in Athenian history had played their roles. Knew, too, that some of them had met their end here. But the excavation soon showed that the site was frightfully ruinous and very hard to understand. I remember in the early days, visitors used to ask, "But how do you know you're working in the Agora?" The answer came in 1938, when we were digging down here toward the southwest. This marble pillar still stands where it was placed round about 500 BC. It's inscribed, and the inscription reads, "Horos aime tes agoras," I am a boundary marker of the Agora. Since this was found, we have come on several other stones of the same series, and it's now perfectly clear that each of the entrances to the Agora was so marked. This one certainly stands at an important entrance to the square. This is all a very interesting confirmation of the fact that in antiquity, one of the most painful punishments that could be inflicted on an Athenian citizen was exclusion from the Agora. Well, now that this whole area has been cleared, we can understand more easily why this spot was chosen to be the Agora of Athens. The determining factor was the roads. Age-old thoroughfares coming in from the Attic countryside, from the Peloponnese and the Piraeus intersected here. This natural meeting place began to be developed for civic purposes in the early 6th century BC. It was devastated by the Persians in 480, but by the end of the century it had recovered and had taken on a fairly regular shape. It was already bordered by a number of substantial buildings, the Heliaia, the Tholos, the Council House, the Stoa of Zeus, the Royal Stoa, and there on the hilltop above, the Temple of Hephaestus. A few of the buildings have been identified by inscriptions, but most of them with the help of Pausanias, who was writing his guidebook to Greece about 150 AD. In addition to the public buildings, the excavations have opened up the environs of the square to east, to south, especially here to the southwest. This part of the town was occupied by a great number of modest dwellings, by a great variety of workshops, marble workers, iron founders, shoemakers, above all potters. We must remember that the Agora lay in the district of the potters, the Ceramicas, and it was due to the fact that the potters lived and worked here in the heart of the city that they were able to give us such vivid vignettes of contemporary life. Passages in Plato and Xenophon imply that the ancient shopper knew exactly where to find any class of goods.
The city contains an infinite number of things, and yet whatever servant you order to buy something in the Agora, he will have no difficulty in finding what he wants.
Commerce was closely controlled in ancient Athens. Here in this round building, the Tholos, there was a bureau of weights and measures. And in excavating round about the building, we have found a good many actual specimens. Here, for instance, is a series of bronze weights. In each case, the denomination is indicated by a figure on top, a shield here, a tortoise there, a knuckle bone here. There is an inscription on the edge of the weight which indicates that this was an official weight of the Athenian people. These weights date roughly 500 BC. Over here we have a number of measures, official measures, a couple in terracotta and one in bronze. These date from the 5th and 4th centuries BC. And in each case they are inscribed as official. There's an inscription running around the wall of the vessel. In this case, in addition to the inscription in very large lettering, we have two official stamps. Here the head of Athena, and over here the head of the owl of Athena. These were official standard measures. The Agora was clearly the scene of commercial and business life. It was also the center of civic administration, and that apparently from very early times. But the oldest substantial buildings for civic purposes date from early in our period, that is roughly the second quarter of the 5th century. Aristotle reports that Ephialtes, the popular leader of the time, took away many of its powers from the Venerable Council of the Areopagus and distributed them among the Assembly, the Council of 500, and the popular courts. This constitutional change had a serious impact on the physical appearance of the Agora. It is clear that a democracy needed both space and accommodation for its proper functioning. Let us look first at accommodation for the popular assembly. In early days, the assembly had met here in the open Agora. After 462 BC, it apparently felt the need of a more convenient and a quieter meeting place. It found this on the gentle slopes of the next hill, here a 6-minute walk to the southwest of the Agora. This was the first of 3 successive auditoria. A slightly smooth segment of hillside served the assembly throughout the second half of the 5th century. Then the orientation was reversed, perhaps to provide some shelter from the wind. Finally, about 330 BC, it was again rebuilt, this time on a monumental scale. The auditorium was supported by a splendid megalithic retaining wall. And this time the speaker's platform was cut from the living rock. This is the best preserved and also the most famous of all speakers' platforms in Greece. A proper building was needed also for the daily meetings of the Council of 500. This council was the executive body of the Athenian government. It had a fantastic range of responsibilities: domestic administration, finance, foreign affairs. For its needs, a large square building was erected here toward the southwest corner of the Agora. You see its site here in front of us. Of the original structure, very little remains. And even these surviving parts have been overlaid for the most part by buildings of later date. To the south is a small round building, the Tholos, we were in before. This served the needs of the Prytanes, panels of 50 who presided over the council in monthly shifts. Here they held their committee meetings and took their meals in common. From a well, we recovered a mass of the crockery used on their tables, plain black glaze stuff, nothing fancy here. Both these buildings date from about 460. In the late 5th century, a new council house was erected behind the old. The earlier building then became available for the storage of public records, which were now being kept in a more systematic manner. It was appropriate that the public notice board should be close to the records office. The public notice board took a very distinctive shape in Athens. large bronze statues of the eponymous heroes, that is, the mythical heroes who had given their names to the 10 tribal divisions of Athens, were set in a row on top of a high pedestal surrounded by a fence. The public notices were pasted on the front of the pedestal. They were of many different kinds: lists of the lawsuits going on in Athens at any one day, lists of men being called up for military service, perhaps most interesting of all, drafts of bills that were to be discussed before the council and the assembly. The eponymous heroes figure prominently in the comic poets, also in the orators of the 5th and 4th centuries. Demosthenes, for instance, in his 24th oration, describes the working of the eponymous heroes.
Anyone proposing a new law shall write it upon a whitened board and set it before the eponymous heroes each day until the assembly takes place.
The third most important branch of Athenian government was, of course, the judicial. Anyone familiar with the comic poets and the orators of the classical period must have been struck by the prominence of litigation in ancient Athenian life. The excavations have, in fact, yielded a sprinkling of the furnishings of the law courts. In the ruins of a building at the northeast corner of the square, we came on a half-dozen small wheel-shaped bronze objects. These are clearly labeled Psephos Demosia, official ballot. They were used by members of the jury for recording their votes. They are of two kinds, one with solid axle for acquittal, one with hollow axle for condemnation. Each member of the jury was provided with a pair of ballots. As he left the court, he carried them between his fingers so that, as Aristotle says, no one could see which he held in which hand. The one that he wanted to count, he threw into a bronze vessel on one side, the other into a discard bin on the other side. Those in the bronze vessel were counted, and according as they were more solid or more hollow, the man was acquitted or condemned. From the presence of these ballots in this building, we infer that it was a courtroom, and it becomes, in fact, the first identifiable courthouse in Athens or in any ancient Greek city. The oldest and the most important of the law courts of Athens, however, was the Heliaia, and it has been identified not with certainty, but with a high degree of probability toward the southwest corner of the Agora. The remains indicate a large rectangular enclosure. Although it had earlier beginnings, this building also appears to have taken its most distinctive form at the time of the reforms of Ephialtes. This was in 462 BC. Little remains of the structure, but enough to give us some idea of its scheme and setting. Here, we're told, the most important cases involving the state were tried. From a well of the late 5th century, just a few meters to the north of the Heliaia, comes this water clock, or clepsydra, the most characteristic furnishing of the ancient law court. It was used, of course, for measuring speeches. The terracotta vessel was filled with water to the level of the hole just below the rim. As the speaker began, a plug was withdrawn from the smaller hole at the bottom, and the speaker could speak as long as the water ran. In this case, 6 minutes. This, I may say, is a unique example of the clepsydra. This may seem a very simple, very primitive timepiece, yet it had its subtleties. As the level of the water fell, the curve of the stream changed, so that an experienced speaker could time himself very precisely by keeping an eye on the stream. Quasi-judicial proceeding that took place also in the Agora was the business of ostracism. If in any year the Athenians expressed concern about a possible dictatorship, the matter was put to a vote, and the voting took place here in the Agora. The ballots took the shape of bits of broken pottery. Ostraca, the Greeks called them in antiquity and still today. A quorum of 6,000 was required, and the man whose name appeared most frequently was required to leave Athens for a period of 10 years. Among the 1,000 and more ostraca that have turned up in the Agora excavations, a great many of the most famous names in Athenian history are represented. Here, for instance, we have Aristides, son of Lysimachus, that is Aristides the Just. Here we have Megacles, the son of Hippocrates. Here is Themistocles, the son of Neocles. I may say that present Themistocles is leading easily. And over here, we even have a sherd cast against Pericles, this in the year 443 BC. From time to time, stern laws were also passed against the ever-present danger of tyranny. One, dating from 336 BC, is preserved on a marble stele. Its principal clause reads,
"If anyone rise up against the people with a view to tyranny, whoever kills him shall be blameless."
Imprisonment wasn't a common form of punishment in ancient Athens, yet there were times when a man had to be kept under detention. A notable example of this was Socrates, who spent the last month of his life between his condemnation and his execution in the state prison. The prison has been recognized through hints in Plato's Phaedo and Apology in a very ruinous building of the 5th century BC outside the southwest corner of the Agora, just beyond the Heliaia. The building consists of a central corridor flanked by cell-like rooms on either side, with here at the northeast corner a semi-detached unit that might very well have served as the residence of the jailer, perhaps also as the headquarters of the commission that looked after punishments. In this building, the excavators found a fragmentary marble statuette of Socrates and a number of small terracotta phials suitable for holding the powerful extract of hemlock. Hemlock still grows near the prison. One of the most distinctive types of Greek civic architecture, and one that played an important role in the life of the Agora, was the stoa. These simple structures had many uses. Sometimes they contained public offices or shops, or had religious functions, but their chief purpose was to provide sheltered promenades for the citizens. The Stoa of Attalus, which was rebuilt in the 1950s, dates from the 2nd century BC. Later, to be sure, than our period, but it does give a good idea of what a stoa was like. The most splendid stoa of our period was the one that took its name from its famous wall paintings and was called the Painted Stoa. The building was famous also as the place where Stoic philosophy had its beginnings about 300 BC, the school that took its name from this building. The Painted Stoa has still to be found, but from many, many references in the ancient authors and from the fine places of some fragments of its superstructure, we believe it to have stood on the north side of the Agora. It would have faced south, an ideal exposure. Some idea of the beauty of the building is given by the painted ornament on this surviving anticapital. Another famous early example was the Royal Stoa. This building has been found. Its ruins came to light in 1970. It's a tiny building, but one of great historic interest. It was the headquarters of one of the senior archons or magistrates of the city, the royal archon. As heir to the king of earlier times, this magistrate was responsible for many important religious and civic matters. It was here, in the Royal Stoa, that Socrates appeared before the royal archon in 399 BC. We also learn, from Aristotle, that the laws of Solon were set up in the Royal Stoa. From a passage in Aristotle's Constitution of the Athenians, we know that each year the 9 archons came to the Royal Stoa to take their oath of office.
Taking an oath at the stone They declared that they would set up a golden statue if they transgressed any of the laws. This is the origin of the oath they still take.
This lithos, this stone, was found in place in front of the stoa. Architecturally, the most distinguished of the stoas in the Agora stood on the west side, just south of the royal stoa. It took its name, the stoa of Zeus, defender of freedom, from a sanctuary of the god that had stood on this place since archaic times. Earlier stoas had been all of limestone, but the stoa of Zeus had a facade of the Doric order and all of Pentelic marble. It also had on its roof acroteria in the form of nikai. But the building's most lasting claim to fame is probably the fact that it was a favorite resort of Socrates in his later years. Time after time, we read in the ancient authors of Socrates sitting or strolling with his friends and disciples here in the stoa of Zeus, looking out across the busy market square, or watching the Panathenaic procession. The stoa of Zeus combined elements of a sanctuary and of a civic building. The same was true of the Nix, of the council house, of the Tholos. But there were also a good many independent sanctuaries in the Agora, among them a number of hero shrines. A very good example of a hero shrine was the Leochorion. That came to light in 1972 at the extreme northwest corner of the Agora. It was a very small shrine, centered on an outcropping of the native rock and surrounded by a stone parapet. It contained a large number of votive offerings, especially miniature vases. It was beside this sanctuary that the tyrant's son Hipparchus was assassinated by Harmodius and Aristogeiton in 514 BC. The Olympian divinities were also well represented in the Agora. The splendid marble temple of Hephaestus and Athena reminds us that gods and men were closely linked in the life of the city. Hephaestus and Athena were worshipped here as patron divinities of the arts and crafts. For their sanctuary, a place was chosen on the top of Colonus, the hill that overlooks the Agora from the west. And on the slopes of the hill, close around the temple, lived the ironworkers, the bronze casters, the potters, the human practitioners of the arts and crafts. Finally, we must keep in mind that the Agora of our period was the scene of some of the most festive happenings in the Athenian calendar. Dramatic performances, choral dances, equestrian displays, the track events of the Panathenaic festival. The procession, the climactic event in the national festival, was best seen as it passed through the Agora. Some idea of its splendor may be gotten from the Parthenon frieze. We have had time to glance at only some of the principal facets of the life that centered in this place. We've seen enough, however, I trust, to show how the Agora reflected the remarkable variety, richness, and intensity of community life in this, the most distinguished of all the city-states.